At my own wedding reception, I watched my older brother casually hover his hand over my champagne flute while pretending to admire the floral centerpieces. I did not panic. I simply waited for him to turn and greet a passing guest, and I switched our drinks. When he turned back, he raised his glass and smirked. "Congratulations, little sister. My surprise is coming soon." I gave him a warm smile and let him drink deep. Exactly 50 minutes later, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Plaza Hotel turned into a theater of absolute horrors. My name is Camille. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life, I have been the designated scapegoat of my wealthy image-obsessed family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago meant undeniable privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial estate, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My father Richard ran a massive international logistics empire, while my mother Patricia was the reigning queen of local high society charity events. They raised their children in a house that felt far more like a museum of impossible expectations than a loving home. My older brother Trent was the undisputed golden child. He followed Richard into the family business with a reckless, impulsive energy that my parents constantly rewarded and praised. He was the son who crashed expensive sports cars and failed out of elite universities only to be met with gentle shrugs and blank checks to cover his tracks. Then there was me, the quiet one, the one who actually studied, who built things, who practically raised herself in the shadows of his glaring spotlight. They never understood my fascination with technology and cybersecurity, viewing it as a bizarre phase rather than a legitimate calling. To them, I was just a mid-level IT manager for their logistics firm, a convenient employee to fix their email passwords and manage their basic servers. They had absolutely no idea that my mundane job was merely a clever cover, a way to silently monitor their corrupt business practices while I secretly built my own elite cyber intelligence firm called Apex Cipher. The wedding was supposed to be a peaceful truce, a single night to celebrate my marriage to David, a brilliant emergency room trauma surgeon who loved me for exactly who I was. We had paid for the entire lavish event ourselves, refusing to take a single dime from my parents to ensure they had no control over the guest list or the catering. But Trent could never let me have a single day in the joy without attempting to cast a dark shadow over it. 50 minutes after he drank from that switched glass, the experimental hallucinogenic laxative he had purchased from the dark web hit his system like a runaway freight train. The live band was playing a slow romantic jazz cover when Trent suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the crowded dance floor. He began sweating profusely, his face turning an alarming sickly shade of gray under the crystal chandeliers. He clawed frantically at his expensive tuxedo collar, his eyes rolling back into his head as he gasped for air. And then he collapsed. He hit the polished hardwood floor, screaming incoherently, flailing his limbs, as if fighting off invisible, terrifying demons that only he could see. Then came the violent, uncontrollable vomiting, right there in front of 300 horrified members of Chicago elite society. The beautiful music screeched to an agonizing, dissonant halt. My mother Patricia and my father Richard rushed toward him, their faces twisted with sheer panic and profound embarrassment. Guests were rapidly backing away in disgust, covering their mouths and whispering furiously to one another. I stood near the elevated DJ booth, watching the chaotic scene unfold with perfect icy calm. Instead of blaming Trent for his obvious and erratic intoxication, Patricia stood up, marched directly onto the stage, and slapped me across the face so hard my ears immediately rang. "What did you give him?" she shrieked, her shrill voice echoing through the dead, silent ballroom. "You planned this cheap wedding just to humiliate him." I did not flinch or cry. I pressed my hand to my stinging cheek and looked down at her with absolute pity. I smiled softly. David pushed past the gawking crowd and knelt beside Trent. While my parents wailed about their ruined reputations, my husband clinically checked Trent's pulse and examined his dilated pupils. David stood up, his voice carrying the calm, steady authority of a man who dealt with life and death every single day. "He is having a severe narcotic overdose," David announced clearly to the room. "I am calling the paramedics right now." The wail of ambulance sirens pierced the night air just a few short minutes later. As the paramedics swarmed into the room, strapping a thrashing, screaming Trent to a gurney and wheeling him out of the ruined reception, Richard turned his explosive fury directly on me. His face was purple with rage as he shoved a thick, heavy legal envelope hard into my chest, knocking the breath out of my lungs. "If your brother dies tonight, your grandfather's trust fund is mine." Richard snarled, his spit hitting my face. "This wedding is completely over. You are finished in this family." I looked at his retreating back as he chased the ambulance out the grand double doors. I did not crumble under the weight of his cruel threats. They were fools. I looked down at the crumpled legal envelope in my hands and simply smirked into the silence. It was exactly what I needed to burn their entire empire to the ground. David drove us to Chicago Memorial Hospital in a thick, deafening silence. The joyful adrenaline of our wedding celebration had completely faded, leaving only the harsh fluorescent reality of the emergency room waiting area. The overwhelming smell of industrial bleach and stale coffee hung heavy in the cold night air as we walked through the sliding automatic doors. We found Richard and Patricia pacing the scuffed linoleum floor like terrified caged animals. Patricia was sobbing loudly into a crumpled tissue, muttering endlessly about how the morning society papers would frame this terrible disaster. Not a single genuine tear was shed for Trent's failing health or well-being. Their only real concern was how this narcotic overdose would impact the pristine reputation of the family name. As soon as the glass doors clicked shut behind us, Richard stopped pacing and locked his manic eyes on me. He lunged across the waiting room, closing the distance between us in 3 long, angry strides. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and yanked out a crumpled legal document, slamming it violently onto the small wooden reception table. "Sign it right now," he barked, his voice vibrating with a desperate, menacing energy that commanded the attention of the few other people in the waiting room. David stepped smoothly between us, his broad shoulders creating a physical shield to protect me from my father's unpredictable wrath. "Back up, Richard." David warned, his tone low and dangerously calm. "We are in a public hospital. Do you really want to make another embarrassing scene right after your son was hauled out of a ballroom on a stretcher?" Richard completely ignored my husband, keeping his furious gaze entirely fixated on my face. "It is a financial power of attorney," Richard demanded, tapping a heavy gold pen against the paper. "Trent needs immediate transfer to a private, discreet rehabilitation facility in Switzerland tonight. We cannot risk the local police getting a formal toxicology report on public record. You are going to liquidate your personal savings accounts immediately and cover the private medical transport. Your little IT salary might not be much, but it will cover the initial security deposit." I stared at the aggressive legal document, feeling a cold, dark laugh bubbling deep in my chest. "You want me to completely bankrupt myself to hide his illegal drug habit?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady despite the rage boiling beneath my skin. "You want me to pay for the absolute privilege of him trying to drug me at my own wedding reception?" Patricia slammed her hands on the table, her eyes blazing with irrational hatred. "How dare you speak about your older brother that way?" she hissed, stepping around David to glare directly at me. "He is the future of this entire family. He is the one who will carry on your father's legacy. You owe him this money, Camille. You owe us this sacrifice." Richard thrust the heavy gold pen directly into my hand, his fingers digging painfully into my knuckles. "Sign the paper, Camille," he ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. "Just like you gave up your full-ride college scholarship so Trent could quietly settle his drunk driving charges out of court 10 years ago. You stepped aside then, and you will step aside right now. Because family protects family." That terrible phrase. Family protects family. They had maliciously weaponized those 4 words my entire life, using them as a heavy, blunt club to beat me into submission whenever Trent needed a convenient human shield. They constantly demanded my money, my precious time, and my fragile sanity to patch the massive leaking holes in his constantly sinking ship. Whenever he failed, they expected me to absorb the impact. But tonight, that toxic phrase was going to be their absolute undoing. I gently placed the gold pen down on the table. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet register that forced them to stop and listen. "And I am absolutely done protecting this corrupt, broken family." Richard raised his hand, his face twisting with explosive raw rage, ready to strike me right there in the middle of the triage center. I braced myself, refusing to blink or look away from his furious eyes. But before he could even swing his arm, the heavy double doors of the emergency waiting room swung open with a resounding crashing thud. Every head in the room turned toward the noise. Kendra walked in. Trent's wife was a striking, brilliant African-American corporate litigator who commanded deep respect the second she entered any room. She was still wearing her stunning emerald green evening gown from the wedding reception, but her demeanor was terrifyingly cold. She was not crying. She was not panicking over her husband's overdose. Her beautiful face was an impenetrable mask of absolute professional fury. She did not look at Trent's parents or offer them any comforting words of support. She marched straight past them, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, and approached the wooden reception table. Kendra pulled a massive, thick, heavy binder from her large designer tote bag. With a swift, powerful motion, she dropped it directly onto the financial power of attorney document Richard was trying to force me to sign. The heavy binder hit the table with a deafening thud that made my mother jump backward in shock. The front cover of the binder bore a bright red bold stamp that read, "Confidential Forensic Audit." Richard stopped breathing, his face suddenly draining of all color as he stared at the red letters. Kendra finally looked at my father, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, predatory intelligence. "I have had enough of this circus," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile room like a sharpened steel blade. "You want Camille to drain her savings to pay for Trent's lavish rehabilitation retreat. Maybe you should first explain why the family logistics company is missing $4 million in untraceable offshore accounts." My mother stared at the red-stamped binder as if it were a venomous snake. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing before she finally turned her vitriol toward her daughter-in-law. Patricia lunged forward, jabbing a manicured finger at Kendra. "You ungrateful woman! My son gave you the Blackwell name. You make 7 figures at your corporate law firm. You are going to liquidate your stock options right now and pay for his transport to Switzerland." Kendra did not even blink. She slowly buttoned her tailored suit jacket over her emerald green dress, radiating absolute authority. "I am not spending a single dime of my hard-earned money to save a man who just flushed $4 million of corporate capital down an offshore crypto drain," she stated, her voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls. Richard finally found his voice, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "Keep your voice down," he hissed frantically, glancing around the empty waiting room. "That is family business. You have no right to steal corporate documents." "I did not steal anything," Kendra shot back, taking a bold step toward my father and forcing him to retreat. "Camille provided the audit. I simply verified the legal implications." "Trent did not just make a bad investment, Richard. He committed federal wire fraud. He forged your signature on 3 different shell company transfers last Tuesday. He bet the entire third-quarter operating budget on an illegal overseas gambling syndicate. He lost everything." Patricia let out a shrill sound of pure denial. She grabbed Richard's arm, shaking it violently. "Tell her she's lying, Richard. Trent would never do such a thing. He has a business degree from Cornell. He is a financial genius." I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Kendra. "He failed out of Cornell twice, Mom. Dad bribed the dean with a new library wing just to let him walk at graduation. You just refuse to accept it because admitting Trent is a failure ruins your perfect country club image." Patricia whipped her head toward me, her eyes filled with venom. "You set him up!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor. "You have always been jealous of him. You forged these documents because you know your father was about to give him the chief executive officer title. You are trying to steal his birthright." Kendra laughed a sharp, humorless sound. "No, Patricia. Trent set himself up. I have the internet protocol addresses, the bank routing numbers, and the forged signatures right here in this binder." The only reason the federal agents have not raided your corporate headquarters yet is because it is Sunday night. By tomorrow morning, this entire family empire is going to be seized, and I am entirely removing my personal assets and my children from the blast radius. Richard looked like he was going to have a massive heart attack. He grabbed his chest, stumbling backward into a plastic waiting room chair. You cannot do this to us, Kendra. You are his wife. Family protects family. Kendra smiled coldly. My family consists of my 2 children. Trent stopped being my family the moment he leveraged my kids' college funds to cover his gambling debts yesterday morning. I am filing for emergency full custody and freezing every joint account we share. Have fun paying for Switzerland yourselves. Before Patricia could launch another hysterical attack, a breathless nurse pushed through the swinging doors. The nurse looked directly at David, recognizing his authority as a fellow medical professional. Dr. Preston, your brother-in-law just regained consciousness. He is highly agitated and aggressively asking for the police. Richard and Patricia shoved past the nurse, sprinting down the hallway toward the intensive care recovery wing. David, Kendra, and I followed closely behind, maintaining our calm, united front. When we entered the private hospital room, Trent looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive tuxedo shirt was ruined, his face was pale, and he was hooked up to several intravenous fluid bags. The heart monitor beeped erratically, reflecting his panicked state. But the moment Trent saw me walk through the door, the sheer terror in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a malicious, calculating rage. He saw Kendra standing next to me, holding the audit binder. He realized exactly what was happening. He knew his secret was exposed, and his reign was over. So he did what he always did. He used me as his human shield to deflect the blame. He pointed a shaking, trembling finger directly at my face. "Arrest her!" Trent screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with artificial panic. "She did this to me. She poisoned my drink at the reception." Patricia immediately rushed to the side of the hospital bed, wrapping her arms tightly around her adult son. "I knew it," Patricia cried out, glaring at me with absolute triumph. "I told you she was trying to destroy you, Richard. She has always been a bitter, jealous monster." Trent gripped the bed rails, continuing his desperate theatrical performance. "She wants to steal the company, Dad. She wants to take my inheritance, so she poisoned me. I saw her slip something into my champagne glass during the toasts. She tried to murder me because she knows I am taking over the board tomorrow." Richard turned toward me, his chest heaving with righteous, furious indignation. He reached for his phone, ready to dial emergency services, but he did not have to. The heavy wooden door to the private hospital room swung wide open. 2 uniformed Chicago police officers marched into the room, their expressions grim and unyielding. They bypassed Richard entirely and walked straight toward me. The taller officer unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The entire room fell into a stunned silence. My parents looked at the officers with absolute glee, finally feeling validated in their lifelong hatred of me. David tensed beside me, ready to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm to stop him. I knew exactly what I was doing. Camille Preston, the officer, said, his voice echoing loudly over the rhythmic beeping of the hospital heart monitors. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You are coming with us for attempted poisoning." The cold steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into my wrists as the officer secured them behind my back. I did not resist. I did not scream or cry or beg for mercy. I simply locked eyes with David. My husband gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. He knew exactly what to do. My mother, Patricia, clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes shining with malicious glee. Richard snarled, his voice echoing down the sterile hospital hallway. "Finally, everyone sees you for the psychotic criminal you really are. Enjoy prison, Camille." The ride to the Chicago precinct was silent. The neon lights of the city flashed through the wire mesh of the police cruiser, casting fragmented shadows across my wedding dress. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, but I felt a different kind of victory taking root in my chest. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea I had built the entire maze. The interrogation room was exactly as cinematic cliches depicted. A scarred metal table, a flickering fluorescent light overhead, and a two-way mirror hiding unseen observers. I sat rigidly in the uncomfortable metal chair, my hands now resting on the tabletop after the officer removed my cuffs. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and a tired-looking man in a rumpled gray suit walked in. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the table with a loud theatrical thud. "I am Detective Miller," he said, pulling out the chair opposite me. The metal legs screeched against the linoleum floor. He leaned forward, folding his hands. He was expecting a weeping, hysterical bride. He expected a woman terrified of losing her freedom and her new husband. "It is a tragedy," Miller continued, adopting a tone of calculated false sympathy. "Your wedding day ruined. Your brother fighting for his life in the intensive care unit. Your own parents providing sworn statements against you. It does not look good, Camille." I remained perfectly still. I did not offer a tear or a tremor. I simply watched him. Miller sighed, flipping open the folder. "Let us talk about motive. You have been a mid-level IT manager at your father's logistics firm for 7 years. No promotions, no board seats. While your brother Trent gets handed the keys to the kingdom. You were angry. You felt overlooked. You wanted to eliminate the golden boy and take your rightful place. Trent just gave us a very compelling statement from his hospital bed. He claims he saw you hovering over his glass during the toasts. He claims you smiled when he drank it." I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made Miller pause. "You have clearly read my father's statement, Detective. It is a compelling narrative, the jealous sister striking out from the shadows. But you are missing a critical piece of context. I never wanted a board seat at that sinking ship of a company. I stayed in the IT department because nobody ever looks at the IT department. Nobody notices the quiet woman upgrading the servers, patching the firewalls, and securing the data storage. Nobody realizes she has root access to every single corporate communication and offshore financial transfer the executives make." Miller frowned, his false empathy evaporating into genuine confusion. "Did you or did you not poison your brother tonight? I need my laptop." I stated, my voice unwavering. "My husband David is waiting in the precinct lobby right now. He brought my bag. Bring me my computer and I will give you the exact truth of what happened tonight." Miller stared at me, weighing his options. He wanted a confession, and he clearly thought giving me enough rope would allow me to hang myself. He left the room, returning 10 minutes later with my heavy silver laptop. He placed it cautiously on the metal table. "This better not be a waste of my time," he warned. I opened the screen. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint, and the heavily encrypted operating system flared to life. This was not the standard machine of a logistics employee. This was the command center of Apex Cipher. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the exact files I had prepared weeks in advance. Miller leaned over, trying to decipher the cascading lines of code, but it was completely beyond his comprehension. "Let me tell you about the substance Trent ingested," I said, turning the screen so Miller could see a simplified dashboard I had created. "It is a highly experimental hallucinogenic laxative mixed with a synthetic amphetamine. It is incredibly rare and exclusively sold on dark web marketplaces. My parents claim I poisoned him to steal the company. Trent claims he saw me slip something into his glass." Miller crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "And you are going to tell me a ghost did it?" "I am going to tell you that Trent is a cornered animal," I replied, keeping my tone clinically detached. "Trent embezzled $4 million from the family business last week to pay off an illegal gambling syndicate. He knew the quarterly audit was scheduled for tomorrow morning. He needed a distraction. He needed a massive public scandal to halt corporate operations and deflect the blame. He intended to drug me at my own wedding. He wanted me to collapse and humiliate myself in front of 300 people so he could quietly doctor the financial ledgers while everyone was focused on the hysterical bride." "That is a wild theory," Camille Miller scoffed, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe your brother poisoned himself just to cover up a theft?" "He did not poison himself," I corrected smoothly. "He poisoned my glass. I simply switched our drinks when he was not looking." Miller slammed his hand on the table. "So you admit to giving him the tainted drink?" "I admit to drinking from my own husband's champagne flute And leaving my original glass exactly where it was, I said, staring him down. I tapped the enter key, bringing up a pristine, high-resolution digital receipt. But you do not have to take my word for it, detective. Look at this transaction record. I intercepted it during my routine network security sweeps. Read the purchase order. Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the screen. His breath caught in his throat. I tapped the screen, emphasizing the crucial details. Check the internet protocol address, detective. Trent bought the toxin himself. It matches Trent's personal penthouse router. And check the payment method. He bought the poison using my father's corporate black card. Miller stared at the glowing screen. The silence in the interrogation room stretched out heavy and absolute. He traced the digital trail I had neatly laid out for him, the timestamp of the transaction, the specific cryptographic signature of the dark web marketplace, the exact routing numbers matching the logistics empire corporate accounts. The realization that the golden boy faked his own poisoning to cover a massive embezzlement hit the detective like a physical blow. Miller let out a long, slow breath. He closed the manila folder. "Wait right here," Miller said, his tone entirely stripped of its former condescension. "I need to have a very serious conversation with your father." Miller stepped out of the interrogation room and walked into the bustling precinct lobby. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low electric hum. David was sitting on a plastic bench, his eyes locking onto the detective. Kendra was right behind him, her posture rigid, her forensic audit binder still clutched firmly under her arm. On the opposite side of the lobby, Richard and Patricia were pacing furiously. When my father saw Miller approaching, he puffed out his chest. "Have you charged her yet?" Richard demanded. "I want her locked away for a very long time." Miller held up a hand, stopping my father in his tracks. "Mr. Wilson, we just ran a preliminary trace on the digital transaction used to purchase the neurotoxin your son ingested. Camille did not buy it. Trent bought it himself. He bought it using a heavily encrypted browser from his own penthouse apartment. And he paid for it using a corporate black card ending in 4192, a card registered directly to your logistics firm." The color drained from Richard's face so fast, he looked as though he might collapse. The blustering, arrogant chief executive officer vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate man. He recognized those 4 digits. He knew exactly what card Miller was referencing. But instead of accepting the horrific reality of his golden child's actions, Richard pivoted to his default survival mechanism. He lied. "It was not Trent." Richard stammered, his voice rising in panic. He began pacing in a tight, frantic circle. "It was Marcus. Marcus is my executive assistant. He has full access to that corporate account. He handles all the overflow expenses for the executive team. Marcus has been acting strange lately. He must have stolen the card details. You need to arrest Marcus right now." I walked out of the holding area, stepping smoothly into the lobby. I leaned casually against the heavy wooden doorframe, watching my father attempt to destroy an innocent man's life without a second thought. Marcus had worked for the family for 15 years. He had sacrificed holidays, missed his own children's birthdays, and worked 80-hour weeks to keep Richard's empire running smoothly. And Richard was willing to throw him into a prison cell just to keep Trent's pristine image intact. "You always cover the tracks, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet precinct lobby. "Family protects family right." Richard whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and fear. "Shut your mouth, Camille." I stepped away from the doorframe. "You will ruin a loyal employee just to shield your golden boy," I said, shaking my head in absolute disgust. "But you cannot cover this track. Marcus was in Tokyo last Tuesday negotiating a shipping contract for you. I have the flight manifests and the corporate hotel receipts." Trent was sitting in his penthouse in Chicago. Furthermore, the transaction required dual-factor biometric authentication. Trent used his own thumbprint on his personal smartphone to approve the dark web purchase. I pulled the system logs. You cannot blame Marcus for a biometric signature. Patricia began to sob openly, realizing the inescapable truth of my words. Her knees buckled, and she sank into a lobby chair, burying her face in her hands. Richard stood frozen, his jaw working silently as his entire worldview shattered. Detective Miller cleared his throat, stepping between us to reclaim control of the situation. The local poisoning charge is no longer my primary concern, Mr. Wilson. We have a much larger problem on our hands. Richard looked at the detective, his eyes glazed with shock. What do you mean? Miller pulled out his radio and gestured toward the precinct doors. Your son used untraceable corporate funds to purchase a Schedule I synthetic narcotic on an international dark web marketplace. He routed the shipment through your own commercial logistics network to bypass customs. The moment corporate funds crossed state and international lines to facilitate the trafficking of illegal narcotics. This ceased to be a local domestic dispute. Miller looked at Richard with grim finality. This is a federal crime. I just got off the phone with the field office. The FBI is taking over the investigation effective immediately, and they are already on their way to your corporate headquarters. The heavy glass doors of the precinct pushed open against the relentless Chicago wind. The storm had finally broken. Rain lashed against the concrete parking lot, pooling under the flickering amber streetlights. The frigid downpour instantly soaked through the delicate lace of my wedding dress, but I did not feel the cold. I only felt the burning heat of absolute vindication. Richard burst through the doors ahead of us, plunging recklessly into the freezing rain. His expensive tailored suit darkened with the water, his pristine leather shoes splashing carelessly through the deep puddles. He marched toward his parked luxury sedan, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He looked like a man running from a ghost. He looked like a man whose entire fabricated reality was collapsing around his ears. He stopped abruptly, turning to face me as David and I stepped out under the concrete overhang. The rain cascaded down Richard's face, blurring the lines of his features, making him look suddenly terribly old. He needed a target. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to absorb the devastating impact of the FBI raiding his beloved corporate sanctuary. He always needed a scapegoat. He always needed someone to blame. He always needed me to carry the weight of his failures. You think you have won? Richard screamed over the howling wind. He took a threatening step forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. You think turning on your own flesh and blood makes you a hero? You just destroyed everything I built. You destroyed the family legacy. I stood calmly under the overhang, letting the wind whip the damp strands of my hair across my face. Trent destroyed the legacy, Richard. I simply turned on the lights so you could see the wreckage. Richard slammed his fist against the wet hood of his car. The metallic boom echoed sharply through the empty parking lot. You are nothing, he roared, his voice cracking with desperate feral rage. You are nothing without me. You are nothing without my company. You think you are so smart, Camille. You think your little computer tricks give you power. You are fired. Do you hear me? You are officially permanently terminated. As of this exact second, you no longer work for Apex Logistics. I am stripping your security clearance. I am seizing your corporate accounts. I am wiping your name from the employee registry. I will personally make sure you never find work in this city again. You are entirely cut off. I stared at him, listening to the hollow echo of his threats. He thought my job was my lifeline. He thought my salary was my leash. He thought he was banishing me to the wilderness, when in reality, he was just locking himself inside a burning building. My security clearance was the only protocol keeping the FBI from accessing his personal hidden offshore ledgers. By revoking my access, he was automatically triggering a total firewall collapse. The feds would have every single redacted file by midnight, but I did not tell him that. Let him feel powerful for 5 more minutes. Let him enjoy the illusion of authority before the federal agents slapped the cuffs on his wrists. Patricia pushed past David and me, shivering violently in her ruined silk dress. She marched into the rain to stand beside her husband, a united front of toxic entitlement. Her makeup ran in dark, muddy streaks down her cheeks, but her eyes burned with unmistakable malice. She fed off Richard's anger. She weaponized his panic. You heard your father, Patricia spat, her voice shrill and piercing against the storm. You are completely cut off, Camille. No more family money, no more corporate benefits, and you are certainly not keeping the house. I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. The house? The bridal home, Patricia snarled, stepping closer, her face twisting into an ugly mask of spite. The beautiful four-bedroom property in Oak Park. The one you have been fixing up for the last 6 months. Do not play stupid with me. You know exactly what house I am talking about. Your father co-signed that mortgage because you were too pathetic to secure a loan on your IT salary. His name is on the deed. His credit secured that property. It belongs to us. David tensed beside me, stepping slightly forward to shield me from the rain and from her vitriol, but I placed a gentle hand on his forearm, holding him back. This was my fight. This was my grand finale. You want the house? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. I want the keys right now, Patricia demanded, holding out her open palm, her hand shaking with adrenaline. You ungrateful, wretched girl. You are going to hand over those keys, and you are going to walk away with absolutely nothing. You do not deserve that house. You do not deserve a beautiful life. I want you to feel exactly what it is like to lose everything. Hand over the keys, Camille. I looked at her outstretched hand. I looked at the rain pelting against her skin. I looked at the desperate, greedy hunger in her eyes. The house in Oak Park had always been a weapon. It had always been a golden cage. It had always been a beautiful trap. They co-signed the loan not out of generosity, but out of an obsessive need for leverage. They used that house to control my weekends, to dictate my holidays, to remind me that everything I owned was ultimately theirs. They held it over my head like a guillotine, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the blade. I reached slowly into my designer evening bag. My fingers bypassed the emergency cache, the encrypted flash drives, and the lipstick, finding the heavy brass ring at the bottom. I pulled out the house keys. The metal clinked softly in my palm. Patricia smiled, a triumphant, vindictive sneer spreading across her wet face. She wiggled her fingers, expecting me to place the keys obediently into her hand, just as I had placed my obedience in her hands my entire life. I held the keys up, letting them catch the amber light of the street lamp. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed them onto the wet pavement. The brass keys hit the asphalt with a sharp metallic clatter, skidding through a muddy puddle and coming to rest directly at Patricia's soaked designer shoes. Patricia's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, bewildered outrage. You insolent little... She began, taking a furious step forward. Keep it, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy rain like a razor blade. Keep the golden cage. Keep the leverage. Keep the beautiful trap. Richard stared at the keys in the puddle, his breathing slowing as confusion momentarily overrode his anger. What are you playing at, Camille? I leaned comfortably against the brick wall of the precinct, savoring the delicious, absolute finality of the moment. I am not playing anything, Richard. Trent used your corporate black card for his dark web transactions, but he also needed a massive influx of untraceable liquid cash to pay off his gambling debts before the bookies broke his legs. So 3 weeks ago, he forged your signature again. He took out a massive high-interest secondary equity loan. Patricia's face went completely slack. A secondary loan. Yes, I smiled, crossing my arms. He used the Oak Park house as collateral. Because your name was on the deed, Richard. It was the perfect untraceable asset. He leveraged the entire value of the property, drained the cash, and handed it straight to the syndicate. I found the paperwork during my audit. I could have stopped the transfer. I could have flagged the fraud. But I decided to let the transaction clear. I deliberately stopped paying the primary mortgage the very next day. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The rain continued to pound against his shoulders. I looked down at the keys resting in the dirty water. You want the house, Patricia? It is all yours. Keep the keys. The bank is foreclosing on it tomorrow morning anyway. Patricia stared at the brass keys resting in the muddy puddle. She stared at them as if they were alien artifacts dropped from the stormy sky. Her eyes darted from the wet pavement to my face and back down again. The reality of my words hung in the freezing air, heavy and suffocating. Foreclosure. The words seemed to short-circuit her perfectly manicured reality. No. Patricia stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. No, that is impossible. Trent would never do that. He knows how much I love that house. He knows I picked out the crown molding. He knows I chose the imported Italian marble. He knows. He knows exactly how blind you are to his faults. Mom, I interrupted, my tone completely devoid of pity. He knows you would never check the statements. He knows you would never verify the signatures. He knows you would blindly sign any document he placed in front of you if he flashed that charming smile. He knows. He knows. He knows. He used your absolute blind devotion to rob you blind. Richard was hyperventilating now. He grabbed the lapels of his ruined suit jacket, his fingers trembling violently. The bridal home, he gasped. He only leveraged the bridal home. We can fix that. We can liquidate some of the lower-performing assets. We can quietly settle the secondary loan before the board finds out. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the precinct. Liquidate what assets, Richard? Do you honestly think a degenerate gambler stops at just one property? Do you honestly think a desperate man holding the keys to the kingdom only takes a small slice of the pie? Both of my parents froze. The rain continued to batter us, but they looked as though they had been turned to stone. I took a deliberate step toward my father, forcing him to meet my gaze. I wanted him to see the exact moment his empire crumbled. Trent did not just leverage my house, Richard. He leveraged your house. He leveraged the family estate in Winnetka. He took out a massive line of credit against your primary residence, your vacation property in Aspen, and the commercial leases downtown. He forged your signature on every single document. He drained the equity from every brick, every stone, every acre of land you own. You are bankrupt. You are completely, utterly bankrupt. Patricia let out a guttural, devastating shriek. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She dropped to her knees in the wet parking lot, her hands grasping at her drenched hair. My house, she wailed. My beautiful house. The country club, the charity galas. What will people say? What will my friends say? We have nothing. We have absolutely nothing. She remained on the wet pavement, sobbing uncontrollably until her frantic eyes locked onto David. My husband stood tall and silent beside me, an immovable pillar of strength in the storm. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her ruined heels slipping on the wet asphalt. She lunged toward David, grabbing his forearm with desperate, clawing fingers. "David," she pleaded, her voice cracking with hysteria. "David, you have to help us. You are a top-tier neurosurgeon. You make incredible money. You have savings. You have investments. You are family now, David. Family protects family. You have to write a check to the bank tomorrow morning. You have to bail us out. We can pay you back. I swear we will pay you back. Just write the check, David. Please write the check." David looked down at her clutching hands. He did not pull away immediately. He simply stared at her with a look of profound surgical detachment. He let her beg. He let her plead. He let her sink to the absolute bottom of her dignity. Then very slowly he reached down and peeled her trembling fingers off his wet jacket. "Patricia," David said, his voice calm, deep, and carrying an absolute chilling finality. "I am not writing you a check. I am not bailing you out. I am not spending a single cent of my money to save your estate. But you are her husband," Patricia sobbed, her face contorted with panic. "You love her. You have to help her family." David stepped closer to my mother, forcing her to shrink back. "Do you remember the dinner at the steakhouse 3 years ago, Patricia? The dinner where Camille went to the restroom and left us alone at the table. Do you remember what you and Richard did?" Patricia's eyes widened in sudden terror. The blood completely drained from her already pale face. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. "I remember," David continued, his voice slicing through the rain. "I remember Richard sliding a certified bank check across the white tablecloth. I remember looking at the amount. It was exactly enough to pay off my entire medical school debt, $250,000. And I remember your exact words, Patricia. You leaned across the table and told me to leave her. You told me Camille was a difficult woman. You told me she would only drag me down. You offered me $250,000 to walk away and break her heart. Leave her. Leave her. Leave her. That is what you said to me." Richard let out a strangled gasp, taking a stumbling step backward. He looked wildly between David and me, realizing that we had shared this secret for years. Realizing that their toxic manipulation had never worked. "You tried to buy my absence," David said, his eyes locking onto Richard. You tried to purchase my loyalty. You thought everyone in this world was for sale just like you. I handed that check back to you, and I told you I would never leave her. I told you I would stand by her through anything. And here I am, Patricia, standing by my wife while you lose everything. So no, I am not writing a check to save the people who tried to bribe me into abandoning the woman I love. Patricia clamped her hands over her ears as if trying to block out the devastating truth of his words. She swayed on her feet, completely broken. Before Richard could attempt another pathetic defense, a sharp, shrill sound pierced the heavy rhythm of the rain. It was a customized ringtone emanating from his breast pocket. The sound was frantic, urgent, and impossible to ignore. Richard flinched as if he had been struck. He reached into his wet jacket with a shaking hand, pulling out his smartphone. The screen illuminated his pale, terrified face in the darkness. I could read the caller identification from where I stood. It was Arthur Vance, the primary majority shareholder of Apex Logistics, the man who held the purse strings to the entire corporate operation. Richard stared at the flashing screen, his thumb hovering paralyzed over the accept button. He knew exactly what this phone call meant. The FBI raid at the corporate headquarters had already begun. The feds were pulling the hard drives. The offshore accounts were being frozen. The board of directors was waking up to a nightmare of federal wire fraud and synthetic narcotics trafficking. "Answer it, Dad," I said, my voice soft but entirely commanding. "Answer the phone." Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He slid his thumb across the wet screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "Arthur," he croaked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Arthur, listen to me. I can explain everything." Even over the howling wind, I could hear Arthur Vance's furious, booming voice radiating from the small speaker. "Richard, what the hell is happening at the main office? Why are federal agents seizing our servers? Why are the corporate accounts locked down?" "Arthur, please," Richard begged, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It is a misunderstanding. It is a terrible misunderstanding. Trent made a mistake." "A mistake?" Arthur roared, the sound clipping through the phone speaker. "The FBI just informed me that our corporate black card was used to purchase illegal narcotics on the dark web. They are investigating us for international drug trafficking, Richard. The board is absolutely panicking. The stock is going to crater at the opening bell." "I will fix it," Richard pleaded, his tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "I will step down. I will resign. Just give me time to fix this." "You do not have any time," Arthur snapped with brutal finality. "I have already convened the primary shareholders. We are holding an emergency board meeting on Monday morning at 8 sharp. Do not bother bringing your lawyer, Richard. You are going to hand over all your voting shares, and you are going to pray the federal prosecutor offers you a plea deal. If you try to fight us, we will throw you to the wolves." The line went dead with a sharp click. Richard slowly lowered the phone, his arm dropping limply to his side. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the wet pavement right next to the discarded house keys. He looked at me, his eyes entirely vacant, his spirit completely crushed. The weekend vanished into a blur of frantic phone calls and shredded documents for my father. Monday morning arrived with the suffocating weight of an impending execution. The executive boardroom of Apex Logistics was a cavernous space deliberately designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the gray Chicago skyline, but the heavy mahogany table anchoring the center of the room felt more like a sinking ship. Richard sat at the head of the table. His usual immaculate presentation was completely gone. His silk tie was slightly crooked. The bags under his eyes were dark and bruised from 2 days of absolute panic. He shuffled a stack of printed financial projections, his hands betraying a slight continuous tremor that he could not hide from the assembled executives. Seated around the table were the 8 primary shareholders. Arthur Vance sat directly to Richard's right, radiating absolute fury. Arthur had built his fortune on calculated risks and possessed zero tolerance for corporate embarrassments. The fact that federal agents were currently circling the logistics empire like vultures had Arthur practically vibrating with rage. He drummed his fingers aggressively against the polished wood, waiting for an explanation. "We need to call this meeting to order," Richard stated, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. He tapped a gold pen against his leather portfolio, clearing his throat twice. We have a temporary liquidity crisis. It is nothing we cannot handle internally, but it requires immediate and decisive action from everyone in this room. Arthur slammed his flat palm against the mahogany wood. Do not insult my intelligence, Richard. A liquidity crisis is a bad financial quarter. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knocking on our loading dock doors, inquiring about international narcotics trafficking, is not a liquidity crisis. It is a catastrophic failure of leadership. Murmurs of agreement rippled down the length of the long table. The other shareholders shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs, casting suspicious glances at the chief executive officer. Richard held up both hands in a desperate, placating gesture. The federal inquiry is a massive misunderstanding. A rogue mid-level manager gained unauthorized access to a corporate account. I have already directed our legal team to cooperate fully with the authorities, but the media fallout is going to cause a severe temporary dip in our operating capital. The banks are getting skittish. We need an immediate cash injection to stabilize our credit lines before the global markets open tomorrow. And exactly how do you propose we conjure this magical cash injection? Arthur demanded, leaning forward so far he was almost invading Richard's personal space. You leveraged everything. The preliminary audit reports I demanded yesterday show massive unauthorized withdrawals across the board. Richard swallowed hard. He avoided looking directly at Arthur, staring instead at the papers in front of him. We liquidate the secondary transport fleet. The room instantly erupted into chaotic shouting. The secondary fleet was the absolute backbone of their Midwest distribution network. Selling it off meant crippling their operational capacity by at least 40%. It was financial suicide. Are you completely out of your mind? Arthur yelled, cutting through the rising noise. You want to sell off our primary revenue-generating assets to cover a mysterious cash shortfall? That is a fire sale. That is the beginning of bankruptcy. You are asking us to gut the company. It is a strategic downsizing. Richard shot back, his voice cracking with pure desperation. We sell the fleet to our main competitor. They have already made a standing offer. We get a massive influx of clean liquid capital. We clear the books. We satisfy the federal auditors. We survive the week. If we do not vote on this right now, the feds will freeze every single asset we possess by noon today. The board members exchanged terrified glances. Richard was brilliantly using their panic against them. He was painting a vivid picture of total annihilation to force them into a blind, immediate vote. He knew that if the board liquidated the fleet, he could use the untraceable cash to replace the millions Trent had stolen before the federal forensic accountants dug too deep into the offshore shell companies. It was a desperate, reckless gamble, and he needed a unanimous board resolution to bypass the standard 30-day shareholder review period. Arthur narrowed his eyes, studying Richard's sweating face with intense scrutiny. You need a unanimous vote for an emergency liquidation of that scale. You do not have the votes, Richard. Trent is completely absent due to his hospitalization, and your daughter Camille holds a mandatory voting seat. Richard smiled, a thin, predatory expression that looked entirely grotesque on his exhausted face. Trent gave me his full proxy vote before his unfortunate medical emergency this weekend. And as for Camille, she is no longer an employee or a voting member of this board. I terminated her employment effectively immediately on Saturday night due to gross insubordination and suspected corporate sabotage. Arthur frowned deeply, adjusting his reading glasses. You cannot unilaterally strip a board member of their voting rights without a formal hearing, Richard. It violates the shareholder agreement. I can when she abandons her post and fails to appear for a mandatory emergency session, Richard countered smoothly, pulling a pre-drafted legal document from his portfolio. According to the Corporate Bylaws Section 4, Paragraph 2, her unexcused absence today constitutes a forfeiture of her voting proxy directly to the Chief Executive Officer. I hold her vote. I hold Trent's vote. I hold the absolute majority. We are voting to liquidate the fleet right now. The boardroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Richard raised his pen, ready to sign the emergency resolution that would strip the company of its assets and cover his golden child's tracks permanently. He looked around the table, his eyes daring anyone to challenge his absolute authority. "I call the vote." Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly in the vast room. "All in favor of immediate fleet liquidation signify by saying aye." Before a single board member could open their mouth, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the boardroom burst wide open. The solid brass handles crashed against the drywall with a thunderous impact that made every executive in the room jump in their seats. Richard froze completely, his gold pen hovering an inch above the paper. I walked into the room. I had traded my ruined white wedding dress for a razor-sharp tailored charcoal power suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe immaculate knot. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a predator cornering its prey. I did not come alone. Kendra strode into the room right beside me, her emerald green dress replaced by an equally ruthless navy business suit. She carried the thick red-stamped audit binder tucked securely under her arm. We walked straight down the center of the room, commanding the absolute attention of every single man at the table. "You cannot call a vote for an empty seat, Richard," I stated, my voice ringing with crystalline authority, "because the seat is not empty, and my proxy belongs to no one but me." The echo of my words hung in the sterile boardroom air. Arthur Vance lowered his reading glasses, staring at me with a mixture of shock and predatory interest. The other shareholders sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, their eyes darting between my father and me. I stood tall at the end of the long table, letting the heavy silence stretch and suffocate the room. Richard turned a blotchy, furious shade of crimson. The momentary defeat I had seen in his eyes in the rainy parking lot was completely gone, replaced by the cornered rage of a desperate animal. He slammed both hands flat on the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water glasses. "Security," he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Get security in here right now. She is trespassing. She has no clearance and she has no voting rights." The heavy double doors swung open wider. Two broad-shouldered security guards stepped into the room. I knew them both intimately, Marcus and John. They had worked the graveyard shifts for 7 years, while I sat alone in the basement patching servers and fighting off malware attacks. They had brought me coffee. I had upgraded their kids' laptops. Richard pointed a trembling finger at me. "Remove her. Remove both of them. Throw them out on the street right now." Marcus crossed his massive arms and planted his feet firmly by the door. John looked at my father with an entirely blank expression and simply shook his head. They did not take a single step toward me. They did not even flinch. "What are you doing?" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I sign your paychecks. I am the chief executive officer of this company. Obey my direct orders." "Actually, Richard, they do not work for you anymore," Kendra said, her voice slicing through the room with forensic precision. She adjusted her glasses, looking at him as if he were a particularly uninteresting spreadsheet. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, Apex Logistics defaulted on its vendor payments. The security contractor pulled their services. Fortunately, a new firm stepped in to cover the payroll and maintain building safety. My firm." I walked smoothly to the head of the table. Kendra matched my pace, her expression unreadable. I took the thick red stamped audit binder from her hands and dropped it onto the polished mahogany right in front of Arthur Vance. Then I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a massive 500-page, heavily encrypted dossier. I dropped it directly on top of Richard's printed financial projections. The deafening thud echoed like a gavel striking wood. "You fired me from IT, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any daughterly affection. "You wiped my name from the employee registry. You thought you were cutting my lifeline. But you forgot who built your entire firewall." Richard stared at the massive stack of paper, his breath hitching in his chest. "What is this?" he demanded weakly. "When you revoked my administrative access on Saturday night, you triggered an automated dead man switch," I explained, turning to address the entire board. "I built that network from the ground up. I coded the security architecture. Every single hidden offshore ledger, every falsified shipping manifest, every dark web transaction your golden boy Trent ever executed was backed up to a secure off-site server. You thought I was just a quiet girl fixing routers. You had no idea I was archiving every piece of dirt you buried. Arthur Vance pulled the dossier toward him. He flipped open the thick cover and began scanning the first page. His eyes widened. He turned another page, and then another, his face draining of color. "Good God," Richard Arthur whispered, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "You ran federal narcotics money through our commercial transport lines. You used the corporate accounts to cover your son's gambling syndicates. You have exposed all of us to federal racketeering charges." "It is a lie," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table again. "She fabricated those documents. She is a bitter, jealous girl trying to steal her brother's inheritance. We need to vote on liquidating the fleet right now. Arthur, we sell the trucks, we cover the shortfall, we survive. Do not listen to her. She has no standing in this room." I pulled a sleek silver remote from my pocket and pressed a single button. The automated blackout blinds hummed to life, lowering smoothly over the panoramic windows and casting the grand boardroom into shadows. The overhead projector whirred, illuminating the large screen on the wall behind Richard. A digital contract flashed onto the screen in crisp, high-definition text. It was heavily stamped with banking seals and federal transaction codes. I stepped into the glow of the projector light. "I am not here to steal an inheritance, Richard. I am not here as the jealous sister, and I am certainly not here as your scapegoat daughter." The board members squinted at the screen, reading the massive financial figures highlighting the document. "When the FBI raided these offices last night, the commercial lenders panicked." I continued, projecting my voice to reach every corner of the room. "Your banks realized they were holding hundreds of millions of dollars in highly toxic debt tied to a criminal enterprise. They needed to offload those loans immediately, before the stock market opened this morning, to avoid a shareholder panic of their own. They held a silent blind auction at 3 in the morning." Richard turned slowly to look at the screen. His eyes traced the bold lettering at the top of the contract. The acquiring entity was clearly listed: Apex Cipher, LLC. "I am here as the chief executive officer of Apex Cipher," I stated, pointing directly at the glowing contract. "While you were busy handing Trent the keys to the kingdom, I was building an elite cybersecurity firm in the shadows. I secured government contracts. I built private wealth. And at 3:15 this morning, I used that wealth to buy every single outstanding loan this company owes for pennies on the dollar. We just bought your bank debt, Richard. I own 60% of this room." The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic collapse. Arthur Vance snatched a digital tablet from the center console and furiously swiped through the banking documents I had just projected onto the main screen. The high-definition glow illuminated his face as his eyes rapidly scanned the federal routing numbers, the authenticated wire transfers, and the ironclad transfer of corporate debt. "She is not bluffing," Arthur whispered, his voice devoid of any color. He looked up at Richard with a mixture of awe and sheer terror. "She holds the paper, Richard. Apex Cipher holds our debt. She owns the absolute majority stake." Richard scrambled backward, his heavy leather chair screeching violently against the hardwood floor. "No," he stammered, his face glistening with a sudden cold sweat. "That is entirely impossible. You are a mid-level manager, Camille. You fix network bugs. You do not have the liquid capital to acquire hundreds of millions in corporate debt. You do not have the backing. You are lying. This is a pathetic, childish stunt. Guards, remove her right now." Marcus and John remained anchored by the double doors. They did not even twitch. "I owned the security contract. I owned the building. I owned the very chair my father was currently sweating in." Suddenly, the massive video conferencing screen on the far wall flared to life. The sharp, piercing chime of an incoming connection echoed through the room, overriding Richard's frantic commands. The screen split, displaying a sterile white hospital room. Trent sat propped up against a bank of pillows. An intravenous line snaked into his arm, but his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He had evidently been listening to the audio feed of the emergency board meeting from his recovery suite. "She is bluffing, Dad," Trent screamed, his voice echoing metallically through the boardroom speakers. Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a nobody. She sits in the basement and plays with firewalls. She does not have the money. She is trying to scare you into surrendering the fleet. Call the police and have her arrested for corporate espionage. I turned slowly to face the high-resolution screen. My golden boy brother looked pathetic. He looked exactly like a man who had built his entire life on unearned privilege and stolen credit. "Hello, Trent," I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm. "It is a miracle you are awake, considering the massive quantity of synthetic narcotics you supposedly ingested on Saturday night. I assume the federal agents stationed outside your hospital door are just waiting for medical clearance to formally arrest you." "Shut up!" Trent roared, slamming his uninjured hand against his hospital tray. "You are a jealous, bitter failure, Camille. You always have been. You wanted my job. You wanted my corner office. You are just throwing a massive tantrum because Dad finally cut you off." I smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of a predator circling a wounded, terrified animal. "I never wanted your job, Trent. I wanted you to face the consequences of your own breathtaking arrogance. You leveraged the family estate. You leveraged my home. You used the corporate black card to fund an international crime syndicate. You thought you could cover it up by faking a poisoning and framing me for attempted murder. You thought Dad would blindly liquidate the company fleet this morning to save you from federal prison." I stepped closer to the camera lens, ensuring my face filled his hospital monitor. "You thought I was just the quiet sister. You thought I was invisible. But you made a critical mathematical error. While you were snorting your trust fund and gambling away the logistics assets, I was building an empire. I secured independent government defense contracts. I built a cybersecurity firm that eclipses this dying logistics company in every conceivable metric. Apex Cipher generated enough clean verified capital to buy this entire building with cash. I did not need to steal your inheritance, Trent. I bought it." Trent opened his mouth to scream again, but the realization was finally penetrating his drug-addled panic. He looked at the financial data scrolling across the secondary projection screen. He recognized the authentic banking seals. The color drained completely from his bruised face. "You always said family protects family, Trent." I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I let the words hang in the air, sharp and precise. "Family protects family, Trent. But I am the board of directors now, and I am protecting my company from you." I turned my back on the video screen and faced the 8 paralyzed shareholders. As the majority debt holder holding 60% of the voting power, I am calling an immediate restructuring vote. I motioned to formally strip Richard Wilson of his title as Chief Executive Officer. I motioned to remove him from the board entirely. I motioned to freeze all executive compensation packages effective immediately. Arthur Vance did not hesitate. He recognized a sinking ship, and he knew exactly how to secure a spot on the lifeboat. "I second the motion," Arthur said, his voice firm and unwavering. "The vote is unanimous," I declared, slamming my hands down onto the mahogany table. The impact made Richard physically jump. "You are fired, Richard. Gather your personal items and vacate my building." Richard looked around the room, his mouth working silently. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the other shareholders. He looked at the security guards. No one moved to defend him. His empire was gone. His authority had evaporated. He was just an old man sitting in a chair he no longer owned. Before Richard could summon the breath to speak, Kendra stepped out from the shadows near the doorway. She had been perfectly silent, observing the total dismantling of the Wilson family legacy with clinical precision. She walked to the center of the table, her navy business suit immaculate, her posture rigid with absolute resolve. Trent was still watching from the hospital screen, his eyes wide with rising panic. "Kendra," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Kendra, tell them this is insane. Tell them we need the money." Kendra did not look at the screen. She looked directly at Richard. She reached up with her right hand and grasped the massive, flawless diamond wedding ring that Trent had presented to her 3 years ago. It was a ring purchased with embezzled corporate funds. She slid the heavy platinum band off her finger. She flicked her wrist, sliding the massive diamond across the long mahogany table. The ring shot across the polished wood like a bullet. It struck Richard's ceramic coffee mug with a sharp crystalline clatter, cracking the porcelain. "I am not your ally, Richard," Kendra said, her voice echoing with devastating icy clarity. "I am the forensic auditor who handed Camille the exact financial blueprints to dismantle your company. I traced every single fraudulent wire transfer your son ever initiated." She turned slightly, finally looking at the screen where Trent was watching in absolute horror. "And I am filing for divorce this afternoon," Kendra stated. "I am filing for full, absolute custody of our children, and my legal team is officially seizing every single one of your remaining clean assets. You are going to rot in federal prison, Trent, and you will do it entirely alone." The video feed from Trent's hospital room abruptly cut out, fading to a blank black screen. Arthur Vance pulled a linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his gleaming forehead. The sheer magnitude of the hostile takeover, combined with Kendra's brutal divorce declaration, had completely shattered the room. Arthur slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. "We are taking a mandatory 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice hoarse. "I need my legal team on the phone right now to verify this debt acquisition. Nobody leaves the building." I turned away from the table, my charcoal suit jacket snapping sharply with the movement. The air in the boardroom had grown suffocatingly thick with the smell of my father's expensive cologne and sour, nervous sweat. I needed a moment of absolute silence. I walked out the heavy double doors, moving briskly down the carpeted hallway toward the executive washroom. The restroom was a sanctuary of cold white marble and brushed brass. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the freezing water run over my wrists. I looked up at my reflection in the vast mirror. I did not look like the quiet IT girl anymore. I looked like a CEO. I looked like the woman who had just conquered the monsters under her bed. The heavy oak door behind me hissed open and slammed shut with a sharp, definitive click. The deadbolt slid into place. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. I could see Patricia in the mirror. My mother looked entirely unhinged. Her meticulously styled hair was fraying at the edges. Her designer suit jacket was rumpled, and she was breathing with shallow, frantic gasps. She looked like a woman who had just watched her personal ATM burn to the ground. "Camille," she gasped, leaning heavily against the locked door. Her voice trembled thick with a sudden forced vulnerability. "Camille, please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. You proved you are smart. You proved you are powerful. But you are destroying your brother. You are destroying your family." I reached for a thick cotton towel and methodically dried my hands. "I do not have a family, Patricia. I have a collection of parasites who occasionally invite me to dinner when they need someone to ridicule." Patricia pushed off the door and took a stumbling step toward me, her eyes brimming with fresh manufactured tears. "How can you say that?" she sobbed, pressing a hand to her chest. "How can you be so incredibly cruel? I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you. I have loved you every single day of your life. Everything I ever did was to give you a beautiful life." I dropped the towel into the brass basket and finally turned to face her. My expression remained entirely blank, a flat wall of granite against her emotional theatrics. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the grieving mother. It is a terrible performance, and you are forgetting that I actually lived through the reality." Patricia reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from my arm. She was desperate for physical contact, desperate to pull me back into the familiar role of the compliant, submissive daughter. "I sacrificed so much for you, Camille." She wept, her voice hitting a perfectly calibrated pitch of maternal sorrow. "Think about your childhood. Think about everything I gave you. Do you remember your senior prom? You wanted that expensive silver dress so badly, and your father said no. But I bought it for you. I took money from my own personal account because I loved you. I wanted you to feel like a princess. I have always been your biggest supporter." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch out until her outstretched hand began to tremble. I remembered that silver dress perfectly. I also remembered the exact conversation she had with Richard in the hallway the night before she bought it. "You did not buy that dress out of love," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You bought it so Trent would not look bad standing next to his sister in the family photos. You bought it because Trent was taking the daughter of the city's biggest real estate developer to the dance, and you were terrified my clearance rack gown would make the Wilson family look like peasants. You literally told Dad that my cheap clothes were a liability to Trent's social standing. Every single gift you ever gave me was just a prop to make your golden boy look brighter. Patricia's jaw slackened, her tearful facade cracking under the weight of the absolute truth. You are twisting things, she stammered, taking a defensive step back. You always twist things to make yourself the victim. Trent is your brother. He is flesh and blood. He made a mistake with the money. A stupid, greedy mistake. But he does not deserve to go to federal prison. He will not survive in there, Camille. You have the power to stop the FBI. You own the debt now. You can sweep this under the rug. I stepped toward her, forcing her back against the cold marble wall. I am not sweeping anything. Trent belongs in a cell. He stole millions. He leveraged my house. He lied, he cheated, and you enabled every single second of it. You covered for him when he crashed his first car drunk. You covered for him when he flunked out of his first university. You covered for him when he started stealing from the corporate accounts. You built the monster, Patricia. Now you get to watch the monster burn. Patricia slammed her hands flat against the marble counter, her eyes flashing with a sudden violently toxic rage. The weeping mother vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious cornered matriarch. You selfish, ungrateful little brat, she hissed, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. You think you are so untouchable now because you have David. You think marrying a wealthy surgeon makes you better than us. David is a fool to stay with you. He is a fool to waste his money and his status on a miserable, vindictive girl. David is the only real thing in my life, I replied softly. And that is exactly what terrified you. You realized you could not control him. You realized his money was out of your reach. Pushed to the absolute brink of her sanity, Patricia lost whatever remaining grip she had on her self-preservation. Her chest heaved, and she screamed, her voice bouncing sharply off the tiled walls. You think Trent took that poison to fake his own death? You think Trent wanted to end up in an intensive care unit? I stopped, my eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Patricia was hyperventilating now, her rage blinding her to the massive, catastrophic error she was making. She pointed a jagged acrylic fingernail directly at my face. Trent did not buy that neurotoxin for himself, you stupid girl. I knew he bought it. I helped him plan the entire thing. That drug was never meant for Trent. It was meant for you. The air in the restroom seemed to freeze. I stood completely motionless, staring at the woman who had given birth to me. Patricia was practically frothing at the mouth, the dark, horrible truth spilling out of her in a relentless, frantic wave. We were going to slip it into your champagne during the wedding toasts, she screamed, her voice echoing wildly. It was supposed to knock you out. It was supposed to cause a massive medical emergency to halt the wedding before you signed the marriage certificate. We needed you hospitalized. We needed David terrified and vulnerable. If you were incapacitated, David would have relied on us. We could have accessed his medical accounts to pay off Trent's debts while you were recovering. But Trent panicked. The idiot mixed up the glasses when the caterers bumped into the table. He drank your poison. He ruined the plan. We did this all to save the family, and you are destroying us. I stared at her, letting the sheer magnitude of her confession wash over me. My own mother and brother had conspired to poison me at my wedding. I slowly reached into the pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was brightly illuminated, showing an active, ongoing call. I tapped the speaker button. Detective Miller, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Did you get all of that? Loud and clear. Mrs. Wilson, Detective Miller's voice crackled through the speakerphone. I have 2 federal agents with me right now. We are walking into the boardroom lobby. Patricia's eyes rolled back in her head as her knees buckled against the marble floor. Patricia hit the cold marble floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Her designer skirt twisted around her thighs, and her pristine manicure scraped against the grout lines as she tried to catch her breath. The sheer gravity of what she had just screamed into the sterile air of the executive washroom was finally penetrating her rage-blinded mind. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the mahogany paneling beneath the sinks, her chest heaving as she stared at the smartphone in my hand. You cannot use that. Patricia gasped, her voice shrill and jagged. She pointed a trembling finger at the device. That is inadmissible. You provoked me. You recorded me without my consent. My lawyers will have that thrown out of court before the sun sets. You are bluffing, Camille. You always play these stupid little games, but you do not have the stomach to actually destroy your own mother. I did not answer her immediately. I simply dropped the smartphone into my pocket, disconnecting the call with the federal agents who were currently locking down the boardroom lobby. I turned my back on her entirely. I faced the wide vanity mirror spanning the length of the wall. My reflection was perfectly composed. Not a single hair was out of place. My charcoal power suit remained immaculate. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a sleek silver tube of crimson lipstick. I uncapped it with a soft click and leaned closer to the glass. I carefully outlined my lips, the bright red stark against my pale skin. I pressed my lips together, smoothing the color with absolute terrifying calm. "Look at me!" Patricia shrieked, struggling to push herself up from the floor. "Do not turn your back on me. I am talking to you. You think a phone recording proves anything. I will say I was under extreme emotional distress. I will say you drove me to a psychotic break. I will say I made it all up just to hurt you because I was angry about the company takeover. No judge in this state will convict a grieving, terrified mother based on a fragmented audio clip captured over a cell phone speaker." I finished applying my lipstick and capped the tube, dropping it back into my pocket. I looked down at my mother's reflection in the mirror. She looked pathetic. The grand matriarch of the Wilson family, reduced to a trembling mess on a bathroom floor, desperately spinning legal defenses she barely understood. I smiled. It was a genuine bright smile that completely unnerved her. "You are absolutely right, Patricia," I said, turning around to face her. "A cell phone recording could easily be challenged by a high-priced defense attorney. They would argue about digital manipulation. They would claim remote wiretapping. They would demand metadata analysis that could stall a trial for years. You and Richard have always been incredibly slippery when it comes to the legal system. Trent learned everything he knew from watching you two evade consequences." Patricia let out a ragged breath of triumph, her shoulders relaxing slightly against the wood paneling. "I told you," she sneered, pulling herself up to her feet and leaning heavily against the counter. "You are not as smart as you think you are, Camille. You bought the debt, but you cannot send me to prison. We will fight you. We will bleed your new company dry in civil court. We will claim you acquired that debt through corporate espionage." I reached up to my throat. I was wearing a delicate string of pearls, a vintage piece I had inherited from my grandmother. I touched the large center pearl, pressing my thumb against the smooth surface. "I am fully aware of how slippery you are, Patricia," I said, keeping my thumb pressed against the pearl. "That is why I never rely on a single layer of security. I prefer redundancies." Patricia frowned, her eyes darting to my hand. "What are you doing?" "Did you get that, detective?" I asked, speaking clearly into the center pearl. At the far end of the executive restroom, the heavy wooden door of the handicap-accessible stall suddenly kicked open. The heavy brass lock shattered against the frame with a violent crack that made Patricia scream and jump backward against the sinks. Detective Miller stepped out of the stall. He was a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that had seen every variation of human depravity. He was holding a high-definition digital audio recorder in his right hand. He pressed a button on the side of the device, stopping the recording with a sharp, definitive beep. I got every single word Mrs. Wilson. Detective Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the echoing tiled room. Patricia's jaw dropped open. She looked from me to the detective and back again, her mind completely short-circuiting. She tried to step backward, but she was already pinned against the marble counter. "You," she stammered, her eyes wide with primal terror. "You were in here the entire time." "I have been in that stall since your daughter called the recess," Detective Miller stated, walking slowly toward her. "I witnessed you physically corner her. I witnessed your aggressive posturing. And I listened to you confess in vivid, explicit detail to conspiring to poison your own daughter at her wedding. There is no wiretapping defense here, Mrs. Wilson. I am a primary physical witness to an uncoerced, spontaneous confession of conspiracy to commit severe bodily harm. Patricia shook her head frantically, her hands flying up to cover her face. No, 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 this is entrapment. You set me up, Camille. You lured me in here. You followed me in here, Patricia. I corrected her, my voice ice cold. I simply walked into a bathroom. You chose to lock the door. You chose to corner me. You chose to scream your confession because your ego could not handle losing control of my life. You poisoned my wedding drink to keep David's money in the family. You wanted me hospitalized so you could steal from my husband to pay off Trent's criminal debts. Please, Camille. Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. She lunged forward, trying to grab my hands, but Detective Miller stepped cleanly between us. Please do not do this. I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot let them take me away. Richard needs me. Trent needs me. Detective Miller reached to his belt. The sharp metallic clinking of steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the pristine washroom. Patricia Wilson, he said, grabbing her right wrist and twisting it firmly behind her back. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault and reckless endangerment. Patricia shrieked a high, piercing sound of total defeat as the cold steel snapped shut around her wrist. She thrashed against the detective, her designer heels slipping on the wet floor, but Miller easily overpowered her, locking her left wrist into the cuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Detective Miller stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy as he spun her around to face the mirror. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Patricia sobbed uncontrollably, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. She looked at my reflection in the mirror, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had never once shown me. Camille, please stop them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I stepped closer, leaning in so she could hear me clearly over her own sobbing. There is no misunderstanding, Patricia. You tried to break me. You tried to poison me. But you forgot one crucial detail. I am the one who writes the code, and I just deleted you from my system. Take her away, Detective. Detective Miller gripped Patricia's arm with practiced authority and guided her out of the executive washroom. I followed closely behind, watching her designer heels drag across the pristine marble floor. The lobby connecting the boardroom to the executive suites was a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. Through it, I saw my father. Richard was standing near the reception desk, clutching his leather portfolio like a physical shield. His face was a mask of gray terror as he watched his wife being marched into the open space, her hands bound securely behind her back in cold steel. Patricia shrieked, struggling against the detective's iron hold. Her voice was shrill and frantic, echoing sharply off the glass walls. Richard, do something. Call the lawyers. Stop them. Richard did not move to help her. He did not pull out his phone to call his legal team. He looked at his wife's tear-streaked face, and then his eyes shifted to me, standing calmly behind the federal agents. He saw the cold, absolute finality in my expression. Richard Wilson was a man who had survived 30 years in corporate logistics by knowing exactly when to cut his losses and abandon a sinking ship. He took one step backward, retreating into the shadows of the corridor. Then he turned and ran. He did not head for the main elevators. He knew the lobby would be swarming with federal investigators securing the building and freezing the main exits. Instead, he sprinted toward the private executive stairwell. It was an exclusive architectural feature he had demanded during his first year as CEO, allowing him to bypass the employee floors and exit directly into his private underground parking garage. His heavy breathing echoed loudly in the concrete stairwell. He fumbled with his smartphone, his hands shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts. He dialed his private aviation broker, a man he paid exorbitant retainers to for moments exactly like this. "Get me a charter!" Richard gasped, taking the concrete stairs two at a time, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the steps. The Caymans, Belize, any jurisdiction without an active extradition treaty. I need a flight ready on the tarmac in 20 minutes. Money is no object. Charge the corporate black card. Sir, the broker replied, his voice laced with sudden confusion. That card was just declined. All Apex Logistics accounts are currently frozen under a federal hold. I cannot authorize a flight without verified liquid funds. Richard let out a panicked, ragged curse and hurled the phone against the concrete wall, watching it shatter into sharp pieces of glass and plastic. He did not need the corporate account. He had personal offshore reserves hidden under shell companies. He just needed to get to his car and drive across the border. He reached the ground floor, landing, his chest heaving with violent exertion. He slammed his entire body weight against the heavy reinforced steel fire door, pushing it open into the dimly lit private garage. He expected to see his black armored town car waiting with the engine running. He expected an empty path to total freedom. Instead, he saw David. My husband was leaning casually against the concrete pillar directly in front of the exit, his arms crossed comfortably over his tailored surgical scrubs. The dim fluorescent lighting caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the quiet, lethal calm in his dark eyes. He looked entirely relaxed, blocking the only exit out of the building. "Going somewhere, Richard?" David asked, his voice perfectly level and devastatingly calm. "Get out of my way!" Richard snarled, stepping forward aggressively. "You do not belong here. You are just a doctor. You have no idea how the real world operates. You always were a weak, soft man. Step aside before I have you physically removed from my property." David did not move a single inch. He uncrossed his arms and stood to his full height, towering over my father. He looked at Richard with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a diseased organ. "You spent years telling Camille she made a massive mistake marrying a surgeon, Richard. You sat at every Thanksgiving dinner and told her my hands were useless because they did not hold corporate leverage or stock options." David took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Richard to retreat back into the doorway. "My hands save lives, Richard. Yours just signed your own arrest warrant." "Move," Richard shouted, raising a clenched fist in a blind panic. David caught Richard's wrist mid-air, his grip locking around the bone like an iron vice. He twisted it downward, applying just enough precise pressure to send a sharp shock of pain radiating up my father's arm. Richard gasped, his knees buckling slightly under the sudden, overwhelming force. "You are not going to the Caymans," David stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding register. "You are going back upstairs. Your daughter wants a word, and so do your shareholders." David released Richard's wrist and physically corralled him, pushing the disgraced executive back through the heavy steel doors. Richard stumbled, panting heavily, his grand dramatic escape reduced to a humiliating forced march up the concrete stairs. David marched him all the way back up to the executive floor, shoving him through the stairwell doors and directly into the main lobby. The scene waiting for them was total, absolute chaos. The local press had arrived, tipped off by the sudden influx of federal agents and the massive hostile corporate restructuring. News cameras flashed wildly, casting brilliant white light across the room and capturing Richard's sweaty, terrified face as David pushed him into the center of the lobby. Arthur Vance was standing by the reception desk, flanked by the remaining 7 shareholders. They stood in a tight, unified formation. They looked like a firing squad waiting for the final command. Arthur stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute ruthless fury. "There you are, Richard." Arthur barked, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising noise of the desperate reporters. "We were just concluding an emergency tribunal in your absence." "You cannot do this," Richard stammered, raising his trembling hands to shield his face from the blinding camera flashes. "I built this company. I demand my mandatory 30 days notice. I demand my full executive severance package. It is guaranteed in my contract." "Your contract includes a strict morality clause," Arthur countered, pulling a freshly printed legal document from his briefcase and holding it up for the cameras. "A clause that is immediately triggered by gross criminal negligence, federal racketeering, and accessory to attempted murder. You turned our commercial logistics empire into a cartel front. You exposed every single person in this room to federal indictment just to cover for your degenerate son." Arthur turned his back on my father, facing the other shareholders and raising his hand high in the air. "As acting chairman, I call an immediate emergency vote." Arthur announced, his voice booming over the lobby. Motion to officially void Richard Wilson's golden parachute. Motion to permanently cancel all unvested stock options. Motion to completely strip his corporate pension based on catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. The 7 shareholders raised their hands in perfect, terrifying unison. Not a single man hesitated. The motion passes. Arthur declared, turning back to my father with a predatory, vicious sneer. The cameras flashed in a rapid strobe, capturing the exact moment Richard's financial empire shattered into absolute dust. You are leaving this building with nothing but the clothes on your back, Richard. You get nothing. You are left with absolutely zero. Trent watched the breaking news ticker scroll across the bottom of the massive flat-screen television in his private VIP hospital suite. The volume was muted, but the bright red urgent banner told the entire terrifying story. Apex Logistics, CEO ousted. Matriarch arrested for conspiracy. Trent stared at the high-definition footage of his father shrinking away from the camera flashes like a beaten, cornered dog. His mother was being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, her wrists locked in cold steel. Trent felt a freezing sweat break across his forehead. The neurotoxin he had mistakenly ingested at the wedding reception was still burning through his system, leaving his muscles weak and his stomach churning. But the primal adrenaline of pure survival immediately kicked in. If Richard and Patricia were going down, the FBI would be walking through his hospital door in a matter of minutes. He was the one who had actually stolen the millions. He was the one who forged the accounting documents. He was the primary target. He remembered the sheer arrogance he had felt just yesterday. He had genuinely believed he was untouchable. He had believed his mother and father would always build a fortress around his mistakes. Now that fortress had been completely bombed into the ground. He threw off the thin thermal hospital blanket. He grabbed the thick IV line taped securely to the back of his hand and ripped it out with a sharp, violent yank. Blood bloomed instantly across his pale skin, dripping silently onto the pristine white sheets. He ignored the stinging pain and stumbled out of the bed, his legs trembling violently under his own weight. He needed clothes. He pushed open the heavy oak door, connecting his suite to the adjoining staff corridor. An orderly cart sat abandoned outside a supply closet. Folded neatly on top of a stack of clean towels was a spare set of dark blue scrubs and a generic gray windbreaker. Trent stripped off his hospital gown, throwing it onto the linoleum floor. He pulled the scrubs over his shivering body, zipping the windbreaker up to his chin to hide his face. He kept his head down, avoiding the gaze of the nurses at the central station. He bypassed the main elevators, knowing local police and federal agents were likely waiting in the main lobby to serve an arrest warrant. He slipped into the concrete service stairwell, taking the steps down to the loading dock. His chest heaved with every agonizing step, the residual poison fighting against his frantic escape. He burst out of the loading dock doors into the freezing city air. He jogged down the alleyway, blending into the heavy pedestrian traffic on the busy downtown sidewalk. Every shadow looked like a federal badge. He reached into the pocket of his discarded suit pants he had managed to grab earlier. His leather wallet was still there. He rushed into a brightly lit corner pharmacy, making a straight line for the ATM near the back wall. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. He stood before the machine, watching the screen glow with a mocking bright blue hue. He pulled out his primary black card, sliding it into the reader. He punched in his PIN code with shaking fingers, requesting a maximum cash withdrawal. The machine took its time processing the chip, mocking his urgency. It beeped a harsh mechanical tone. Transaction declined, account frozen. Trent cursed, slamming his fist against the plastic casing. He pulled out his platinum corporate card. He knew Arthur Vance would cut access, but surely there was a delay in the system. There was no delay. Declined. He tried his personal gold card, a private account he kept hidden from his wife. Declined. The message on the screen coldly instructed him to contact his financial institution. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. His financial institution was currently being raided by the FBI. Every single financial lifeline he possessed had been severed. He was completely locked out. He backed away from the ATM, his eyes darting wildly around the pharmacy. He needed to make a call. He noticed a display of cheap prepaid burner phones hanging near the checkout counter. The cashier was distracted, ringing up an elderly woman. Trent snatched a small black box from the rack, ripping it open as he walked briskly out the front doors, avoiding the security sensors. He dumped the packaging in an overflowing trash can, powering on the cheap plastic device. He ducked into a narrow, damp alley between two brick buildings, shivering violently against the winter wind. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago, a number he never saved in his primary phone to avoid his wife's suspicion. It was Chloe, his secret mistress, the woman he had stashed $500,000 with under a dummy corporation just in case his embezzlement at Apex Logistics ever caught up with him. The phone rang 3 times. Trent pressed his back against the cold brick wall, praying she would answer. "Hello," Chloe's voice came through the cheap speaker, crisp and clear. "Chloe, it is me." Trent gasped, his voice rough and frantic. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The feds raided Apex. My parents are gone. All my accounts are frozen. I am on the street and I need cash right now. I need you to wire the $500,000 from the offshore holding account to a Western Union. I will text you the location. You need to do this immediately, Chloe. They are hunting for me." Across the city, inside my sprawling corner office, Chloe placed her smartphone flat on my massive glass desk. The speakerphone broadcasted Trent's desperate, pathetic demands to the entire room. I sat behind the desk, my hands folded perfectly over a stack of legal documents. Kendra Vance sat directly beside Chloe, looking impeccable and victorious. Kendra had tracked the mistress down, using her own ruthless private investigators, ensuring every loose end of the Vance and Wilson corporate empires was tied. She had dragged the girl here, offering her a very simple choice: hand over the money or go down as a co-conspirator. Chloe had chosen self-preservation. Chloe looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I gave her a single, slow nod of approval. "I cannot do that, Trent." Chloe said, her voice remarkably steady. "What are you talking about?" "You cannot do that," Trent barked, gripping his burner phone so tightly the cheap plastic creaked. "It is my money. I set up the account in your name to hide it. Wire the funds right now, or I swear to God I will drag you down with me." "There is no money left, Trent," Chloe replied, picking up a luxury fountain pen from my desk. "I am sitting across from your sister right now. She offered me a full witness immunity deal to testify against you. I am currently signing the transfer documents. I am handing the $500,000 directly over to Camille to cover the stolen corporate funds." Trent stopped breathing entirely. The freezing alleyway suddenly felt like a tomb. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold glass desk, and spoke clearly toward the phone. "You always were terrible at hiding your assets, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and lethal. "Your mistress just bought her freedom with your stolen cash. The police are tracing this call as we speak. I suggest you stop running and wait for the sirens. It is over." The line went completely dead. Trent had dropped the call, but the absolute silence in my office was louder than his pathetic screaming. I set the smartphone flat on the glass desk and leaned back in my leather chair. Chloe sat shivering in her designer trench coat. She looked at the blank phone screen as if it were a venomous snake. She had been Trent's dirty little secret for 3 years, but sitting in this room under Kendra's piercing gaze, she had withered into a terrified cooperator in less than 5 minutes. "Start talking, Chloe," I commanded, leaning forward, resting my hands on the glass. "Give me the account numbers, all of them." Chloe swallowed hard, her manicured fingers trembling as she pulled a small, encrypted hard drive from her coat pocket. She placed it on my desk, pushing it toward me like a peace offering. "He kept everything logged on this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He thought he was brilliant. He bragged about it constantly. He set up 6 different shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He named them after his favorite golf courses because he thought it was hilarious. Cypress Point Holdings, Pine Valley Logistics, Augusta Offshore. Kendra Vance leaned over, grabbing the hard drive with a predatory grace. She plugged it directly into the secure terminal on my desk. The screen flared to life, displaying layers of encrypted folders. Passwords. Chloe. Kendra demanded, her tone leaving absolutely zero room for hesitation. Chloe rattled off a sequence of alphanumeric codes. He used my birth date combined with the day he stole his first million from your company, she admitted, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. He told me it was our anniversary. He transferred exactly $85,000 every Tuesday and Thursday directly from the Apex corporate logistics budget. He routed it through a phantom vendor in Mexico before burying it in the Caymans. He told me the federal auditors were too stupid to ever look at the secondary vendor routing numbers. Kendra typed furiously, her eyes scanning the massive columns of illicit wealth materializing on the screen. He has over $4 million scattered across these 6 accounts, she stated, her voice a sharp blade of legal calculation. It is a textbook layering scheme. He thought moving it through international waters would wash the digital fingerprints. He thought wrong, I said, turning my attention to my primary workstation. I opened the core command interface for Apex Cipher. When I built this cybersecurity firm, I designed our algorithms to track phantom data packets through the most convoluted dark web networks on the planet. Trent's amateur hour laundering scheme was incredibly sloppy by comparison. I uploaded the routing numbers Chloe provided directly into my tracing algorithm. I did not need to wait for a federal judge to issue an international subpoena. I already possessed backdoor access to the Apex Logistics accounting mainframe. I mapped his stolen funds, matching the outflow from my father's company directly to the Cayman accounts. Kendra pulled out her cell phone, dialing a direct line to the federal prosecutor overseeing the Apex raid. "We have the offshore ledgers," Kendra barked into the receiver the moment the line connected. "I am sending you the routing numbers and the shell company designations. File the emergency international injunctions right now. Invoke the Patriot Act. Freeze everything under his name, his mistress's name, and the phantom corporations." As Kendra executed the flawless legal maneuver, I initiated the technical strike. I linked the Apex Cipher tracking protocol with the federal banking freeze requests. My monitors illuminated with 6 green progress bars. Each bar represented one of Trent's offshore accounts. The synchronization was absolute. I watched the numbers rapidly decrypting, bypassing the standard international banking delays because I was feeding the federal servers the exact authentication keys. "Watch this, Chloe," I said, pointing to the large monitor on the wall. "Watch what happens to a man who thinks he can steal from me." The progress bars hit 100% simultaneously. The numbers on the screen violently scrolled backward. $4 million, $2 million, 500,000. The balances plummeted in real time as the global banking network slammed iron doors over every single digital vault Trent Wilson possessed. The numbers stopped moving. Every single account displayed an available balance of exactly 0. Trent was completely financially paralyzed. Across the city, Trent was shivering violently in the freezing alleyway. The neurotoxin was relentlessly punishing his nervous system. His vision blurred at the edges, and his legs felt like they were made of wet sand. He stared at the blank screen of the burner phone he had just dropped on the wet asphalt. Chloe had turned on him. His mother was in handcuffs. His father was utterly destroyed. The money was gone. He stumbled out of the alleyway, keeping to the darkest shadows. He could not use a credit card. He could not check into a hotel. He could not even hail a cab. He was a fugitive with absolutely nothing to his name except the stolen scrubs on his back and a desperate, failing memory. He dragged his hand across his sweating face, trying to force his poisoned brain to focus. He remembered the charter. 2 weeks ago, he had paid $30,000 in untraceable cash to a private pilot at a small municipal airfield 20 miles outside the city limits. It was his ultimate contingency plan. A ghost flight to a non-extradition zone. The pilot did not ask questions, and the plane was fueled and waiting in Hangar 4. He just needed to get there. Trent found a battered delivery bicycle leaning against a chain-link fence behind a diner. He stole it, throwing his leg over the seat and pedaling frantically into the night. The 20-mile journey was absolute physical torture. The freezing wind whipped through his thin jacket, chilling him to the bone. Every push of the pedals sent sharp spikes of agony through his weakened muscles. He vomited twice on the side of the dark highway, his body rejecting the physical exertion while fighting the residual poison. Hours passed in a dark, agonizing blur. He pedaled through desolate industrial parks and abandoned access roads, driven solely by the animalistic urge to survive. He finally saw the chain-link perimeter fence of the municipal airfield. There were no bright runway lights, just the dim orange glow of the security lamps spaced far apart along the tarmac. Trent ditched the bicycle, letting it clatter into a frozen ditch. He dragged his exhausted body over the cold wire fence, tearing the fabric of his scrubs and slicing his palms on the sharp metal. He did not feel the pain. He dropped onto the tarmac, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He saw the massive corrugated steel structure looming in the darkness ahead. A faded painted number 4 marked the side of the building. He broke into a desperate, limping run. This was it. Salvation. The pilot would be sleeping in the ready room. They would fire up the twin engines, and he would be over international waters before the sun came up. He reached the heavy metal side door of the hangar. He grabbed the handle, throwing his entire body weight backward to yank it open. Trent stumbled into the pitch-black interior of the hangar, gasping for breath. "Hello, Trent," wheezed his voice, echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "Get the plane ready. We are leaving right now." A massive bank of overhead halogen lights suddenly slammed on, bathing the entire hangar in blinding white brilliance. Trent threw his hands up to shield his eyes, squinting through the harsh glare. He lowered his hands and his heart stopped completely. The hangar was utterly and entirely empty. The vast expanse of smooth, polished concrete stretched endlessly before him. There was no private jet. There was no pilot. There was no escape. Standing in the absolute center of the empty hangar, directly under the brightest lights, were 6 federal marshals. They were wearing dark, tactical gear, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. They stood in a perfect semicircle, blocking the main hangar doors. The lead marshal stepped forward, holding a thick stack of printed warrants. "Trent Wilson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and flight to avoid prosecution." The lead marshal's voice boomed through the cavernous hangar, bouncing off the corrugated steel walls. "Put your hands on your head and interlock your fingers right now." Trent did not comply. The neurotoxin ravaging his nervous system was suddenly entirely eclipsed by a blinding surge of sheer animal panic. He spun around, his stolen, oversized scrubs flapping against his shivering frame, and bolted toward the heavy side door he had just breached. He barely made it 3 frantic steps. 2 marshals hit him simultaneously from behind. The impact was like colliding with a freight train. Trent was launched forward, the air violently expelled from his lungs, as his face slammed directly into the freezing, polished concrete of the hangar floor. He tasted copper and heavy dust. A heavy knee drove sharply between his shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the ground, while rough, unyielding hands yanked his arms backward. "Get off me!" Trent screamed, spitting blood onto the tarmac, as cold steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into his skin. "Do you have any idea who I am? My father is Richard Wilson. He owns half the real estate in this city. He will have your badges for this. He has the best corporate defense attorneys in the state on retainer. My father will bury you." Trent thrashed wildly, his face scraping against the abrasive floor. He fully believed his own desperate threats. In his fevered, panicked mind, he pictured his father sitting in a mahogany-paneled war room, surrounded by a legion of ruthless lawyers preparing to unleash hell on the justice system to protect his golden boy. He pictured Richard writing a blank check to make this entire nightmare disappear and restore the family name. But Trent was entirely wrong. At that exact moment, 20 miles away, in a decaying strip mall on the absolute worst side of the city, Richard Wilson was not commanding an army of lawyers. The former titan of Apex Logistics was standing under the flickering, buzzing neon light of a 24-hour pawn shop. His bespoke Italian suit was stained with cold, nervous sweat, and his hands were trembling violently against a scratched glass counter. Richard stared at the thick bulletproof glass separating him from a bored pawnbroker chewing gum. On the metal tray between them sat Richard's ultimate pride and joy. A solid platinum Rolex Daytona embedded with custom diamonds. A watch that retailed for nearly $80,000. I told you, man. The pawnbroker droned, sliding the heavy luxury watch back toward Richard with complete indifference. 4,000 cash. That is the ceiling. Take it or walk. Are you out of your mind? Richard hissed, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known in his entire life. The movement alone is worth 10 times that amount. I just need a short-term collateral loan. I have vast offshore reserves. My corporate accounts are just experiencing a temporary federal hold. Do you know who I am? The pawnbroker popped a bubble and pointed a lazy finger to a small handwritten cardboard sign taped to the glass. We do not do temporary federal holds, buddy. 4 grand. Final offer. I am closing in 10 minutes. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back a massive wave of absolute nauseating humiliation. His corporate empire was gone. His golden parachute had been voided in front of the press. Every bank account routing number and safety deposit box associated with the Wilson name had been frozen by federal mandate. He had literally emptied his pockets of loose change just to pay the cab fare to get to this miserable side of town. He needed exactly $50,000 in liquid cash to pay a shady bail bondsman to secure Patricia's release from the county holding cell. His wife was currently sitting in a concrete cage facing federal conspiracy charges, and this heavy piece of metal on the counter was the last tangible asset he had left in the world. Fine. Richard choked out the word, tasting like bitter ash in his mouth. He pushed the Rolex back under the glass slot, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. Just give me the cash. Hurry up! Back at the freezing airfield, Trent was roughly hauled to his feet by the federal marshals. His knees immediately buckled the neurotoxin and the massive adrenaline crash, turning his legs to absolute jelly. The marshals caught him under the armpits, dragging him upright with zero sympathy. You are making a massive mistake, Trent babbled, his head rolling back as he looked wildly at the lead marshal. I did not act alone. My mother planned the corporate takeover. My father authorized the shadow accounts. I can give you everything. I want a deal. Call my father. Let me call my father. He will bail me out tonight. Nobody is bailing you out, Trent, the lead marshal stated, checking the tightness of the cuffs and gripping his bicep. You have a mandatory federal hold pending your arraignment, and your father is currently under active investigation. You are completely on your own. Trent sobbed, a raw, pathetic sound that echoed loudly in the empty hangar. The reality of his absolute isolation finally crushed him. The golden boy of Apex Logistics was bleeding in stolen scrubs, shivering in the cold, with absolutely no one coming to save him. The marshals began marching him toward the hangar doors. As they stepped out into the biting winter wind, a pair of blinding white headlights swept across the dark tarmac. A sleek black armored SUV rolled silently past the security gates and drove directly toward the hangar. Trent's head snapped up, his heart leaping into his throat. A wild, manic spark of hope ignited in his chest. A black SUV. It had to be a fixer. It had to be Arthur Vance or one of the high-priced corporate fixers his father kept on speed dial. He was not abandoned. The family was still fighting for him. Wait! Trent yelled at the marshals, struggling against their grip and trying to stand taller. Look, that is my representation. I told you. You are all finished. The marshal stopped, remaining perfectly stoic as the heavy SUV glided to a halt just 10 feet away. The powerful engine purred with a low, menacing rumble. The passenger side window slowly glided down, revealing the interior of the luxury vehicle. Trent leaned forward, a triumphant, arrogant smirk forming on his bloody lips. The smirk vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Sitting in the back seat, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the dashboard lights, was Camille. She was wearing a stunning emerald green trench coat, looking completely immaculate and completely untouched by the chaos of the night. She rested her arm elegantly on the window frame, looking down at her older brother. Her expression was a terrifying mix of absolute power and total satisfaction. "Enjoy your surprise, big brother," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air. "Just like you promised in your toast." I tapped the button on the armrest, and the tinted window smoothly rolled back up, cutting off the sight of Trent's screaming face as the federal marshals dragged him away into the darkness. 7 days later, the absolute destruction of the Wilson family legacy was officially immortalized in print. I sat at the expansive marble island of my new Chicago penthouse sipping a perfectly brewed espresso while admiring the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline dominated the upper fold in bold, unforgiving black ink. Apex Logistics, CEO indicted in multi-million-dollar offshore laundering scheme. Below the headline was a massive high-resolution photograph of Trent being shoved into the back of a federal transport van, his face pale and contorted in sheer terror. Beside him was a smaller insert of my father Richard, looking aged and entirely broken outside the federal courthouse. The article detailed every agonizing aspect of their collapse. Arthur Vance had systematically dismantled the board installing Kendra as the interim CEO and publicly severing all ties with the Wilson name. Trent was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, denied bail due to his explicit status as a severe flight risk. Patricia was under strict house arrest, wearing a GPS ankle monitor and facing decades in prison for corporate conspiracy. But for a man like Richard Wilson, the legal peril was secondary to the absolute societal annihilation. He had spent his entire life building a fragile house of cards based entirely on perception status and elitism. Now that house had been subjected to a hurricane. Richard attempted to cling to the last remaining shreds of his fabricated dignity. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, he drove his leased sedan. His armored town car had been seized by federal asset forfeiture agents to the Oakbrook Elite Country Club. It was the crown jewel of his social calendar, a place where he had spent 30 years holding court over scotch and cigars. He walked through the heavy mahogany double doors, expecting the usual obsequious greetings from the staff. He expected to retreat into the leather wingback chairs of the Founders Lounge and pretend he was still a king. Instead, he was intercepted in the center of the grand foyer. Marcus, the general manager who had kissed Richard's ring for 2 decades, stepped directly into his path. Marcus did not offer a warm smile or a glass of aged whiskey. He held a crisp white envelope. The foyer was bustling with Chicago elites, hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and corporate lawyers. Every single conversation in the massive room slowly ground to a halt as people turned to watch the spectacle. Mr. Wilson Marcus said, his voice carrying a cold, clinical detachment that echoed off the marble floors. "I have been instructed by the board of directors to hand you this official notice. Effective immediately, your membership at Oakbrook Elite has been permanently revoked." Richard froze, his face flushing a deep, violent crimson. "What are you talking about, Marcus? I am a legacy member. I personally sponsored half the men on the board. You cannot do this." "The board has a strict morality clause regarding ongoing federal criminal investigations," Marcus replied loudly, ensuring every billionaire in a 50-foot radius heard him perfectly. "We must respectfully ask you to vacate the premises immediately. Security will escort you to the parking lot." Richard looked frantically around the room, seeking an ally. He locked eyes with William Sterling, a pharmaceutical giant he had golfed with every single Sunday for 10 years. William simply turned his back and took a sip of his martini. Richard Wilson was a social leper. He was a contagion. He snatched the envelope from Marcus and turned on his heel, practically sprinting out the heavy mahogany doors, while the whispers and quiet laughter of his former peers burned into his back. The ultimate humiliation occurred 2 nights later. Desperate to secure a private loan to cover his mounting astronomical legal fees, Richard attempted to meet a shadowy venture capitalist at his favorite downtown elite steakhouse. He had held a permanent reservation at Prime Table Number 1 for 15 years. He walked up to the maitre d' desk, projecting a false aura of total confidence. "Good evening," Francois Richard boomed, attempting his old, arrogant charm. "My usual table, please." Francois, a man who used to greet Richard with profound reverence, looked at him with absolute icy disdain. I am sorry, sir, but your reservation has been cancelled. Cancelled! Richard snapped, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the packed dining room. I did not cancel anything. I am Richard Wilson. Give me my table. Francois sighed and pulled a printed memo from beneath the podium. Sir, the corporate card associated with your profile has been federally frozen. Your personal accounts have been declined across all our systems. Our restaurant requires a valid credit authorization for all elite bookings. You have no valid funds. The surrounding patrons fell silent. Men in custom-tailored suits and women in diamonds turned their heads to watch the former titan of logistics being publicly labeled a pauper. Run it again, Richard hissed, slamming a useless gold card onto the podium, his hands shaking violently. Run it again! I have run it 3 times, Sir Francois stated, his voice booming over the quiet dining room. It is completely declined. You have 0 available balance. I must ask you to step aside and let paying customers through. Richard snatched his card back, his chest heaving. He looked at the sea of judging wealthy faces staring at him. The absolute naked pity and disgust in their eyes broke the very last string of his sanity. He turned and stumbled out onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, the cold realization finally settling into his bones. He was nothing. A torrential downpour hit Chicago that night. Thunder rattled the skyscraper windows and lightning flashed across the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. I was standing in the expansive living room of my new luxury penthouse, staring out the floor-to-ceiling glass at the raging storm. The fireplace cracked softly behind me, casting a warm glow over the sleek modern furniture. I swirled a glass of vintage red wine, enjoying the absolute total silence of my hard-won sanctuary. Suddenly, the secure intercom mounted on the marble wall chimed sharply, cutting through the quiet. I frowned, setting my wine glass down on the kitchen island. I walked over and tapped the video feed button. The high-definition camera mounted at the reinforced steel security gates of my building flickered to life. Standing in the absolute pouring rain, completely soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was Richard. His expensive suit was plastered to his gaunt frame, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked up at the camera, his eyes wide, desperate, and completely broken. He reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the intercom button again. Camille, his voice cracked through the speaker, distorted by the heavy rain and his own pathetic tears. Please. Please let me in. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. Absolutely. I pressed the intercom release button. The heavy steel gates buzzed open, echoing in the storm. I did not invite him up to my immaculate penthouse. I had no intention of letting him ruin my sanctuary. Instead, I took the private elevator down, stepping into the brilliant, warm light of the ground floor reception area. Richard was standing near the concierge desk, shivering violently. He was leaving a dark, muddy puddle of rainwater on the pristine white marble. He looked like a drowned rat, completely stripped of every ounce of his former arrogance and power. Camille. Thank God, Richard gasped, taking a desperate, stumbling step forward. The security guard immediately moved to intercept him, but I raised a single hand, stopping the guard in his tracks. I looked at my father with absolute chilling calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. I need a loan, Camille, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking as dirty water dripped from his nose and chin. Just a few $1,000s. Enough for a cheap studio apartment somewhere out in the suburbs. Just enough to buy food. They took everything. The house, the cars, the offshore accounts. Your brother is in a federal holding cell and your mother is facing decades in a penitentiary. I have absolutely nothing left. I am begging you. You are my daughter. You have to help me. I stood perfectly still, watching him tremble. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single neatly folded document along with a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. I placed them on the edge of the marble reception desk, pushing them directly toward him. I am not giving you a loan, Richard, I stated, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of pity. I am offering you employment. I recently acquired a controlling interest in the corporate restructuring of Apex Logistics. They are clearing out the old executive rot and rebuilding the company from the ground up. There is a current opening that fits your new qualifications. Richard's eyes widened with a sudden pathetic spark of hope. An advisory role, he asked, his voice trembling with eager, desperate anticipation. A senior consultancy position. A night shift warehouse janitor. I replied seamlessly, watching the hope die instantly in his eyes. You will be cleaning the executive washrooms and mopping the loading dock floors from midnight until 8 in the morning. It pays strict federal minimum wage. There are absolutely no health benefits, no pension, and no stock options. But it will just barely cover the rent for a tiny studio apartment. Richard stared at the employment contract as if it were coated in lethal acid. His face crumpled, the last remaining fragments of his pride dissolving into the muddy puddle at his feet. He opened his mouth to protest, to scream at the sheer, unimaginable indignity of scrubbing the floors of the very empire he used to rule. Take the mop or starve on the street, I said, my voice a quiet, lethal blade. Because like you always taught me, family protects family. Richard Wilson let out a guttural, agonizing sob. He fell heavily to his knees on the wet marble, his shoulders heaving as he wept uncontrollably. With a shaking, defeated hand, he reached up, grabbed the cheap plastic pen, and signed his name on the dotted line. The scratching of the cheap plastic pen against the contract was the final definitive sound of the Wilson patriarch's reign. I did not offer Richard a single parting word of comfort. I simply turned my back on his sobbing, trembling form and stepped into my private elevator, leaving him to his mop, his bucket, and his new miserable reality. The wave of absolute justice did not end in my lobby. The very next morning, the media circus shifted to the downtown federal courthouse. Kendra emerged through the heavy bronze doors, looking less like a broken housewife and more like a conquering queen. She wore a flawless, tailored ivory suit, her head held high behind a pair of oversized designer sunglasses. A legion of high-priced aggressive attorneys flanked her, holding the stamped judicial decrees that finalized Trent's complete destruction. During the closed-door proceedings, Kendra had methodically unveiled every single piece of financial evidence linking Trent to the offshore accounts and the massive corporate embezzlement. The judge had shown zero leniency. Kendra won everything. She was awarded full physical and legal custody of their 3 children alongside an astronomical, unassailable settlement. Trent's remaining legitimate assets, his luxury cars, his hidden investment portfolios, even the deed to the summer home in Aspen, had been entirely, completely liquidated and transferred directly to Kendra. He was left with absolute zero. She did not stop to give the shouting press a tearful statement. She simply flashed a razor-sharp, victorious smile and stepped into the back of a waiting black SUV. While Kendra rode away in triumph, Trent was experiencing a very different kind of reality. Deep inside the maximum security wing of the Federal Correctional Facility, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly over rows of steel cages. Trent sat shivering on a thin metal cot wearing a stiff, scratchy orange jumpsuit that marked him as federal property. The reality of his situation had finally crushed his fragile, arrogant mind. A heavy-set guard unlocked the barred door and pointed a nightstick down the bleak concrete corridor. "You get one call," the guard barked. "Make it count." Trent stumbled toward the wall-mounted telephone, his hands shaking violently as he picked up the heavy plastic receiver. He had nobody left. His former corporate allies would not even acknowledge his existence. His country club friends had blocked his number. He dialed the only person who possessed the power, the resources, and the sheer leverage to pull him out of this nightmare. Miles away inside the sprawling, newly renovated executive suite at the top of the corporate tower, I sat behind my massive glass desk. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the room, highlighting the sleek modern architecture. My private cell phone vibrated sharply against the glass surface. The caller ID displayed a stark, ominous message. "Incoming call, Federal Correctional Facility." I pictured Trent standing in the cold concrete hallway, panicking, sweating, praying for a lifeline. I felt a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I reached out and casually pressed the red decline button, silencing the phone instantly. I picked up my gold fountain pen and turned my attention back to the thick stack of legal documents resting on my desk. They were the final corporate restructuring forms. I signed my name with a fluid, confident flourish across the bottom of the final page. I officially approved the immediate rebranding of the entire logistics empire. The Wilson name was permanently entirely erased. The company would now be known globally as Apex Vanguard. I had not just taken their power, I had completely wiped them from existence. The ink dried on the final document, marking the absolute conclusion of a war I never started but ruthlessly finished. I left the towering glass office behind, trading the heavy weight of corporate restructuring and hostile takeovers for the light sun-drenched breeze of a new beginning. David was waiting for me on the street level beside the sleek black town car, his warm, steady smile in immediate contrast to the sterile, ruthless business world I had just conquered. We were finally taking our long-delayed honeymoon. The white sands and turquoise waters of the Maldives had been waiting for us. The smooth drive to the international terminal felt like a quiet, well-deserved victory lap. As we walked through the heavy sliding glass doors, the frantic, chaotic energy of the regular concourse completely faded away. We effortlessly bypassed the long, agonizing security lines and stepped directly into the hushed, exclusive sanctuary of the first-class luxury lounge. It was a pristine haven of plush leather seating, soft ambient lighting, and absolute unbroken peace. I sank into a deep, oversized armchair overlooking the massive tarmac, watching the massive jets taxi against a vibrant, brilliantly painted sunset. It was a profound, silencing serenity. The absolute, complete contrast to the frantic, miserable lives my former family was now enduring struck me with perfect, sharp clarity. Trent was currently shivering in a tiny concrete box, desperately clutching a useless phone receiver. Richard was putting on a soiled uniform, preparing to push a dirty mop across a freezing loading dock floor. Patricia was locked inside her own empty house, wearing a heavy GPS ankle monitor and staring blankly at the walls, waiting for her impending criminal trial. They were drowning in the absolute devastating consequences of their own toxic greed and endless malice, while I was quite literally preparing to fly away. A sharply dressed waiter approached our secluded corner carrying a polished silver tray. He offered us 2 tall crystal flutes of vintage complimentary champagne. I reached for mine, but David playfully intercepted it before my fingers could touch the glass. He held the crystal flute up to the ambient light, narrowing his eyes in mock suspicion. He swirled the bubbling golden liquid, examining it with exaggerated theatrical scrutiny. "Let me just make sure your mother did not somehow sneak back into the catering kitchen," he said, his voice totally deadpan. "We need to be absolutely certain nobody slipped a lethal dose of crushed bitter almonds into the vintage reserve before we toast to our freedom." A genuine, unrestrained laugh erupted from my chest, echoing softly in the quiet, luxurious lounge. I reached out and gently took my glass back from his hand. I clinked my flute against his, the crystal chiming with a bright, flawless, resonant sound. There was no poison. There were no toxic family members left lurking in the shadows waiting to strike or manipulate or destroy. There was only absolute, undisputed victory, and a sweet, untouchable future stretching out endlessly before us. I took a slow sip of the crisp, perfect champagne and leaned my head happily against my husband's shoulder. True empowerment is never found in seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. Blood does not demand your endless loyalty, especially when it is continuously repaid with manipulation and betrayal. The ultimate victory is not the chaotic destruction of your abusers, though karma often handles that naturally. True victory is the absolute peace you secure when you stop fighting for a seat at a toxic table and choose to build your own empire instead. Your unapologetic success is the only statement you ever need to make. Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to finally reclaim your peace? Share your story in the comments below. If you found strength in this journey of empowerment, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about taking back your life.